So here we have a Spanish artist. It's 19th century. We've already have now the independence movement has succeeded. Mexico is independent of Spain, and yet we still have eyes on Europe. We still have the very strong connection to the arts and the artists that are coming from Spain. So here we have Montezuma II. What we have is the tie-in directly with the indigenous past, but in a very Europeanized stance. We called it the contrapposta, one leg in very firmly attached here, straight leg, and then slightly bent here with the contrapposta pose. This is very typical, the arm here holding the beautiful cape, but it is a disconnect from what we were looking at before with regards to even how the indigenous communities and cultures would even represent their own kings. If you think of things like Pacal, when we were looking at him, very regal and not really always incorporating the body, but that was just literally his head. So we are doing this because what we have here is that the eyes of Europe are looking to the European traditions coming directly out of the Academy of the École des Beaux-Arts. So the academies in Europe, whether it be Spain or France, all were centered on this very strong academic training. Now they're going to bring this academic training with them to Mexico, and the Academy of San Carlos will be started just before the Mexican independence. So that's going to be at the very end of the 18th century. We were looking here again at another image. What I talked about this was being a plaster cast. So this would have been part of that tradition that we saw in the school, the Academy of San Carlos. Eventually it did end up becoming into a bronze. And so this is on display in Mexico. But again, it's this kind of disconnect. I don't know, the more you look at art history, you would see the engagement of the body and the classical tradition. And so this would be part of that educational process. And we're going to see this come up again, especially when we look at the work of Diego Rivera next week, because he's going to be trained in this classical way as well. We then went and we then started looking at Mexican artists, people who are now established. They are going to be influenced by the art of the neoclassical period. So this here is a reference to classical antiquity and the use of the body. This is when we talk about Greek and ancient Rome sculptures and statues. And then neoclassicism, this ability to then incorporate it in a new way. So this is moving forward. And this was a movement that was very strongly used there in Europe. And so what we have here is the discovery of pulque, but in an idealized, very presenting our ability to read the figures, lining them up, the steps. We know that this is not likely what it looked like, so this is an idealized form. But here we now have a Mexican artist still engaging with eyes on Europe, but starting to really look for a language that would give them indication of national identity, but not quite there yet. The torture of Guatemala is also important. This is going to be at the very end of the 19th century. And Izaguirre is going to be another Mexican artist. Now, this is going to be an important remembering of the torture that he received at the hands of Cortez. Here, his feet are to the flames. This image is going to be used specifically with David Alfaro Siqueiros in a mural in the Palacio de Bellas Artes. And so the same subject matter, but now we're looking at it through a modernist lens. And so we're going to see a very interesting way in which he's going to engage. Here, literally, you can see the flames over here, bracing himself by holding his fists while he's being tortured. This is a man on the balcony. It just tells you the scale, how large this is. This is a mural. and the repetitiveness of some of the language that we had with regards to the 4 factors that led to the downfall of the Mexica Empire. The snarling dogs that I mentioned in the lecture, as well as the men on horses and armor and guns and cannons. And so what we have here is the same story, but now it's moving forward in a more modernist tradition, and then a smaller image, not a mural, of his torture, where David Alvarado Siqueiros, when we look at him more carefully, we'll look at this image again, the flames literally are just heaviness with the impasto, so the actual oil on paint here really is very vibrant, and it comes out. So we were looking at the lens, and we can now see where we're shifting towards. That what we're going to be looking at today are what we call the precursors to Mexican modernism. And we're going to focus on 3 artists in particular. So a precursor means this is the movement getting ready to lead towards modernism. And the Mexican modernist mural movement will come in the 1900s. And so we're looking at these 3 artists who date range does have them cross over into that realm, but we're looking very specifically at their works and their thinking and why that was a precursor. So Jose Maria Velasco, we started with just yesterday. He dates from 1840 to 1912. So 1912 is important because the Mexican Revolution starts in 1910. And it goes into until 1920. So this will give us an indication that they're going to be looking at a lot of these transitions. We're going to look at the work of Jose Guadalupe Posada, and he's going to be important because he will be using an understanding of the abuses of power, the abuses of government, and especially at the hands of the people and the masses. We will also be looking at him particularly because of his ability to relate visual imagery to a highly illiterate population. So at this period of time, in the late 1880s, moving forward, we do have about 80% illiteracy rate in Mexico, so very high illiteracy rate. And then we're going to look at the work of Murillo, who switches his name. He says, I become baptized and become Dr. Otto. Dr. Otto embracing a Nahuatl word for water. He's a volcanoist, studies volcanoes, and so water is the opposite. So that duality that we were looking at earlier is going to be embraced with his name. So he embraces that by going and choosing a name and being baptized by it. So we're going to start again with Jose Maria Velasco by underscoring the fact that he was trained at the Academy of San Carlos. And at this time, the artists that were teachers were often Europeans. And so what we have here are not only Spanish painters and sculptors, we also have Landesio, who's an Italian. So Landesio comes into the Academy, and he is going to start bringing in some of the traditions of landscape painting that he had been accustomed to there in Europe. And what he will do here is the Valley of Mexico. And he does it in a lovely way by framing some of the landscape. Here we have the nopal cactus that I mentioned, the shadow that is cast with the people who are literally picnicking within the foreground, and then moving our ability to see this wonderful expansive landscape in the background. Now, he will be the teacher of Jose Maria Velasco, and it will be his studies there at the Academy that puts him in contact, and he will do the same image, but he will do it differently. He will actually start to be more expansive in that landscape and start to highlight a Mexican identity, a symbol of Mexican identity, because he will incorporate some of the rings of the volcanoes. Now, what's interesting about Jose Maria Velasco is that initially when he went to the Academy and started to learn, he was not interested in in being an artist or a painter. He was interested in zoology and botany. So he was able to take that ability of looking at the natural world, and he would start to do that by highlighting the fact that he would start to draw from it. Now, what we have to remember is that when we think about the disciplines of the scientific mind and the artistic or the humanities, in the modern world today, our contemporary world, what we do is we separate them. And I talked about that math and science sit on one side of campus and the arts sit on another. Traditionally, when we talk about the university system, those two sat together. So science could not be understood without the careful eye of observation. So science was tied to observation, and art was tied to observation. So the two of them came together. So here we have Jose Maria Velasco incorporating his scientific knowledge by looking very carefully at the sky, zoology, botany, and drawing from nature, drawing and spending time in the landscape. And so his initial interest really was in the sciences. Now, what's extraordinary about him in particular is that he's what we call a polymath. He's somebody who's also very gifted in mathematics. And so he's using all of these science studies to eventually then shift into becoming an artist. Now, what's particularly important of this image here is that he captures this identity, takes very similar ways in looking of what we're seeing here with Landesio. So we've got this shadow that's being cast, and we know that because we can see the images over here thrown with that placing of the sun. And we'll see some of that same kind of movement over here. So we don't have the picnic, but we have figures moving through the landscape. And as they're moving through the landscape, this is a landscape that he would have moved through. He's situated here looking out. Mount Isabella is his point of departure. He will then underscore what we were looking at yesterday, the importance of this hill here, Tepeyac Hill, where the Virgin La Virgen de Guadalupe appeared to Juan Diego, which would put his, the basilica made in her honor is going to be over here. We have the rings of the volcanic activity that is very much centered there in Mexico. So Mount Popo and Maritza, these are going to be important mountains that are beautiful when you think about the still are active. They occasionally, on occasion, smoke, and it makes everyone a little nervous, but they're snow-capped in the winter, and it's extraordinary to see. What he's done here now is he's started to look very specifically at the building of Mexico City as we know it today. Now, what's going to happen are the Spaniards are going to drain Lake Texcoco. So the area that was once on a lake bed is now going to be drained. And what we have here is evidence of the causeways. And so the causeways were those man-made pylons that allowed people to enter through into the precinct, the Tenochtitlan over here that would be in the middle, and all of the building that would be part of that would have been no longer there. So the floating gardens, the chinapas, are now going to be drained as they start to drain Lake Texcoco. So what we have here is also the first hints of modernization. And what we have is literally a train now going through the landscape. So the building campaign and the move towards modernization will come with the work of Porfirio Diaz. He's going to, as I mentioned yesterday, put in electrical trolley cars. He wants to have transport. And he's doing this because he's now going to try to get capitalism, people who have money, who are interested in striking monetary commercial deals with Mexico and putting Mexico basically on an economic map. And again, we have to remember that Mexico, after its independence of 1821, simply was bankrupt. It didn't have the means in which it could protect its own borders, and it needed to find some way to negotiate movement into the modern era. So Jose Maria Velasco is important because he is tied to academic painting. So this is the kind of work that comes out of the Academy of San Carlos. And his work is tied to the natural scenery of his own country, specifically the Valley of Mexico. He first painted the view of the Valley of Mexico from the hill of Santa Isabel, and painted repeatedly the same subject throughout his life, 9 times in total. We talked about him studying with Landeso, and he entered the Academy of San Carlos in 1858. His paintings won first place at the Paris Exposition in 1889. He also received the gold medal of the National Exposition of the Bellas Artes in 1874 and in 1876, and then the gold medal at the Philadelphia International Exposition of 1876. His paintings are quiet and serene, and he painted more than 400 oils and also worked in pencil and watercolor. And so the pencil would be preliminary drawings that he would have been doing out of sketches. This is a self-portrait that he did of himself, very much engaging with us in his eye contact, slightly, his shoulders are slightly to the side, but his head is turned to capture our attention. So the Valley of Mexico is going to be the area that he's going to be looking at, and we're going to start to see this appear over and over again. Here is this image directly from San Isabel. So here in 1877, he's making reference again, the same image that we saw earlier, the draining of Lake Texcoco, the causeway that would be there in the distance. Here, the remnants of Tepeyac Hill. But here, Mexico identity, we've got an eagle making its way in flight, and here we have the nopal cactus. And so we have this tied directly to the landscape that is tied to this image in particular. We looked here at just the distance and being able to look at the hacienda. More than likely, some of the area here is not necessarily a train, but what it is the agricultural movement of land to be cultivated. And so these are part of the haciendas are tied to what was happening with regards to the Spaniards. And so this is still a tie to some of the issues that happened at contact. But here's where it really gets exciting. And this is where the train comes in much more profoundly. He is interested in this modernization. And you can just imagine here, all of a sudden, literally turning the corner, here we have the steam engine pushing through, right? You have the movement here and the smoke that is then emitted, and here it's coming through in the landscape itself. So much like what we were seeing earlier, that framed by the volcano over here, Citlaltépetl. So this is going to be here in, again, the very volcanic region of Mexico, the flora and fauna that is tied specifically to the area, but coming through around the bend is modernism, right? There's a modern ability to harness man and machinery and moving in the direction that will soon take place in the 20th century. So what I wanted to also highlight is that we always have to be careful with our reproductions as well. This is an image, unless you end up going to see it, you see reproductions, and oftentimes we don't really know where the color lies. Here's the same image, but with a different characteristics, with a different tone and coloring. So I always want you to be aware, sometimes we have to look more than once to kind of figure out where the coloring is and why it's so important for us to be able to go to museums and to actually access them and to have the experience to stand before the object itself. And so what we have here is the meandering stream tied to nature, and then the insertion of modernism literally coming around the bend, right? This ability to capture trains. And he'll do this again in other objects. And so what we're seeing here is that for him, we are going to see an artist that is engaged with a pivotal time. He is a trained academic artist, and now he's going to be incorporating this identity of Mexico in the landscape. And this ties us back to some of the earlier work we were doing when we saw the Mesoamerican past also incorporating the landscape into their their identity, right? This identity that becomes part of their object. We're going to now move to Jose Guadalupe Posada, and Jose Guadalupe Posada is going to be important because he's going to reject a Eurocentric lens. So this idea of what we were seeing coming out of the work that was out of the Spaniards that were producing art objects there in Mexico, he's going to make a complete rejection. And his emphasis is going to be satirical. So satirical is making fun, right? He's going to be making fun of things that place the government in opposition to the benefit of the people. Jose Guadalupe Posada, to a large degree, is self-taught. What we have here is him in front of his taller. So this is going to be the workshop, right? And here is an image of him. So we are also going to take a little bit of a look at photography today, but we already now know the camera will come into play, and there he is, literally in a workshop. Now, this is going to be important because at the time when he finally makes his way to Mexico City in 1888, he will have two artists that we'll be looking at next week. At the time, we have Diego Rivera, who's now going to be at the Academy of San Carlos as a student. He will walk by his studio, his workshop, and he'll be peering in to look at him produce a lithograph plates and produce mass-produced objects. We're going to take a look at the broadsheets in just a moment. And then the other artist would be Orozco. Orozco was younger, and so he's going to be in what we call the preparatory school. So he will also walk through, and they're going to influence these two modern Mexican muralists. And what they would talk about is that they would collect the shavings from his workshop and basically found him to be extremely important in their own understanding of their own ability to be an artist. What does his art look like? Well, what he's going to do is he's going to use the calavera. So he's going to tie into popular culture and also this syncretic ability. When we talk about Catholicism, celebrating the dead is something that we know that was done with the indigenous population, but now is going to be embraced with Christianity. That happens to coincide in the same time of a celebration period of time, so it was an easy one to make this combination. So syncretic is taking two very different habits of mind and pulling them together and having it come together in a way that could identify and buy into both of them. So he's going to use the calavera. The Day of the Dead imagery is using the calavera in particular, and he's going to do this in what we call a very popular format. So these are going to be broadsheets. They're rather interesting. They're literally, you know, they vary in size, but they're made on very inexpensive paper that is very acidic. And so what ends up happening is that they age and they yellow very quickly, and the paper, if not preserved, becomes very brittle and they simply just fall apart. But what is important for us to know here is that he's going to use the ability to have an object, right, his work, be read by an illiterate population. And so what he's going to do is he's going to animate these calavera, and people are going to be hearing about things and they're going to get enough of it. So two things are happening. Now, they're going to oftentimes have corridos, they're going to have songs that are going to be written, and this is an easy way to understand what's happening through being able to hear it, right, to be able to hear it, and then also to see it visually with regards to the paper. So we'll take a look at some of these images here that he would do. So what he would do is he would create an image, and then it would be reproduced in a process of literally taking that plate and then having the image then reproduced on very inexpensive paper that would then be sold for pennies on the street. Very popular, okay? Tied to the calavera, so here is some of the unrest, and we can see that a lot of these images are going to be centered on a number of things that are happening in anticipation of the Mexican Revolution. So where all of a sudden the masses become involved in revolutionary thought, and then coming to the streets. And we'll see some of those objects next week. But it gives you an idea here where he is able to then take the image and then incorporate it into the broadsheet. Some of it does have some language, sometimes it doesn't, but giving an indication as to what's happening in the day to day. And it is really a rejection of this Eurocentric ability of other newspapers that were there, and also very popular, but for a very literate group of people. And we'll see some of those when we look next week at the Mexican Revolution. He will often use the same image for another publication or another printing. So it was not something that was unique to one printing itself. This one tells us and gives us a date, so it's 1910. And as I had made mention, this is the period of time during the Mexican Revolution where all of a sudden you've got all this energy, where the masses are coming together, they're protesting, and they're basically protesting because under the Diaz dictatorship, he ruled with what we call a very iron hand. It was pan or palo, so it was bread or stick. So he was able to control the people because he kept them basically in their place, and they remembered that. So again, just looking at the differentiation, same image and same kind of topic, but going to be used again. So these broadsheets are important because they're able to get people excited about what's happening, and that participation puts them where you can see literally the motion that's going involved, this idea of running and gathering some of the steam in which change will then occur. He'll use images like the Don Quixote, so images that might be more popular, some to a more literate group as well. And I just love the fact that, you know, they end up into the spreadsheet, the broadsheet as well. And so it gives you just a number of ways in which the broadsheet can be engaged. This is one I chose because of COVID-19 and our own issue with the pandemic. There was an issue with regards to cholera. And so what he does here is he highlights the fact that, you know, the cholera is going to kill can kill everyone. And here he's basically highlighting that no one can escape death. The rich or the poor can't escape death, and the issue of cholera at the time, it didn't matter if you're rich or poor, it was there. And very much like what we're seeing here today, rich, poor, we're seeing the effects of COVID-19 in our own worldview as we stand. So I thought it was interesting to see even then how he could take something like cholera and tie it into that we all will face death. It doesn't matter if we're educated and learned over here with the books, or somebody who works with tools and their hands. So a number of the calaveras and their tie to the work that they did in their station in life doesn't exclude them from the fact that death is always at our doorstep. Here, when I talked about the idea of the electrical trolley car, this would have been there in Mexico City, and here we've got the Gran Calavera, so this larger Calavera there, looking at everybody, the masses, and you can see they're totally engaged. He's got that direct connection, and fascinated with the electric trolley car. And so the trolley car is here, and this would have been part of that modernization movement where all of a sudden trolleys and transportation was accessible to the masses, right? So all of a sudden you could go in and you could see how that would be used. And so he's highlighting that. And then this would be closer, just the image itself. And so here, the fascination with electricity and how it was going to radically change the gas lamps that were once the only way to have light, right? And this one's interesting because he did sign it. Now, Posada is probably most famous for this one here. This is La Catrina. And this is making fun of the Europeanized dress at the time. And so when we talk about eyes on Europe, when we look at that through the artistic traditions, we have to also remember that the elite, right, people who had a moneyed class, are also going to be looking at Europe in particular with regards to dress. And we saw some of that in some of the self-portraits with regards to the very fancy satin coats, the frilled blouses that they would wear. And so this was an indication as to money, right, where they stood within the socioeconomic situation, right, where they stand. Are they a moneyed class or a non-moneyed class? Are they a worker or intellectuals? And the La Catrina is important because it's making fun. This very fancy hat here with feathers and flowers, and all of this is going to be tied to that, what we call the dandy, right? The male component of this in a fancy top hat, usually with a walking stick. And we highlighted, just for a brief moment again, Sunday afternoon in Alameda Park, where Posada is there literally with his Calavera Catrina. So here in full figure with a fancy Europeanized dress, a young Diego Rivera as a schoolboy, behind him Frida Kahlo. So you're going to take a look at this, and Khan Academy has a beautiful way of highlighting what's going on with this ability to take a timeline and put it all together in one object in particular. So when we talk about that Europeanized dress, this is what I'm referring to. This is taken from Mexico City. And when I talk about those top hats, you can see them over here. When we reference those walking sticks, they're literally there for the men. And here, the women with their parasols, keeping them from the harshness of the bright sunlight. And so what we have here is an image by the Casasola brothers. They are two brothers who are going to start using photography, and they don't look at themselves as artists. They look at themselves as documenting. So they're going to use the camera to document what they see, and those images are going to be used in newspapers as well. But the newspapers are going to differ from the broadsheets that we saw with Jose Guadalupe Posada. The broadsheets are going to be inexpensive. They're made for the masses. The literate are going to be reading newspapers, will unfold. We'll see how that will work. And those photographs will be inserted into, much like what we see when we look at a newspaper account today. You know, we see images always pulled together, and that's the way we have greater insight or access to what the newspaper article is. Sometimes it's the image that captures us to want to read parts of the newspaper. Another image of what's happening there in the park. Again, now we're starting to see a little shift. The women's dresses are starting to get a little shorter, not too short, but you can see their ankles. And again, a very elite class. This is Mexico City. So Mexico City, mimicking much of some of the Europeanized trends that were happening. And it shows that dialogue, right? That the elite always had access to what was going on, women with their fancy hats, and men with their vests, polished shoes, and they're in the park. Now, it's not just the elite that are important. It's also important, the Casasola here has some images of the vendors. And so it puts you in juxtaposition to see the difference with regards to the amount of wealth. So here we have literally being able to sell objects, very, very typical, still happens today. But the kinds of clothing of much more of the working class. What I love about this image in particular is that you really do see the quality of the print up here, just some of the rendering of the photograph, but more specifically, the photographer is here in the foreground in a shadow. And I thought that was a wonderful way of highlighting the importance of looking not just at the image and what you see, but looking at those recessed areas or the shadows that also give us some insight and information. This is an image of Casasola. They were two brothers, and some of just their interest in again, modernity. Now we're going to see our objects with electrical cords that are going to be plugged in, so music and radios and all of these things that we take for granted because we know they exist so readily in our world, now are going to be part of the modern world. So we're going to take a look at more of his work next week when we look at the Mexican Revolution, because one of the things will happen is that the Casasola brothers will then start to shift from capturing Diaz and the stately photographs into more of what's happening for the revolutionary thought, and then capturing those in photographs in particular. And the last artist that we're going to look at with regards to modernity is Dr. Otto. And Dr. Otto's interesting because he is absolutely engrossed with the ability to look at volcanoes. Again, he studied volcanoes, so this is going to be his ability to take that very exact study of being a volcanoist, and then it will translate into his artwork. He too studies at the Academy of San Carlos, and so what happens to him is that prior to Porfirio Diaz, what would happen is he would, before the downfall and Mexican Revolution, he would find young, deserving artists or intellectuals, they didn't have to be artists, and he would provide them what's called a pension. A pension is like a scholarship. And what he would do is he wanted them to spend time in Europe and to gather some of the thoughts that were going on in the international world. And Dr. Otto received in 1897 a pension to basically study painting in Europe. And so he will end up going to Europe to do so. This will also be true of people like Diego Rivera. And it was for the very elite who were educated, who then were capturing the broadening of their experiences by spending time abroad. Dr. Otto was very long-lived. He dies in with a relatively he's I think he's 88 when he dies, and so here we catch him towards the end of his life. He's in a wheelchair, and here he's painting the beloved volcanoes that were so much part of his signature. Now, like what we were seeing with the work of Velasco, the volcanoes are now going to be important here as a way of Mexican identity as well. So the Ring of Fire that we talk about, and Born of Fire with the basalt, all of this is now coming back in the precursors to modernism and in looking at that moving forward. So what will happen is he will get too close to a volcano and he ends up losing one part of his leg, and that puts him in a wheelchair, just to let you know. So his whole thing was to get in front of them and watch them basically explode. Otto, again, is going to be a glyph, and we did look at that when we were looking at the possibility of reading it differently than the snake that we were looking at when we were looking at the throne and also the Mexican flag. So it's not only a Nahuatl word, but it is his, what he calls his baptism, this ability to go back and to look at his identity with the Mesoamerican past. So what does his art look like? You're never going to fail to recognize it. It is powerful. It is volcanoes, a little bit much more direct, none of this kind of beautiful landscape that we see in the work of Velasco, but really the power of the eruption, the power of the smoke, the power of all of this power that can have this eruption of being able to see a volcano. So what we're seeing here is going to be this identity within the landscape, and this is going to be reiterated with the work of Dr. Otto. Now, what's interesting here is that he's also, he's going to use pastel. He's going to draw, much like we saw with Velasco. He's going to do sketches. So he's constantly engaged within that landscape. And what we have here is that while Diaz is still a dictator in the early part of the 20th century, he is going to commission Dr. Otto to create a stained glass for the Palacio de Bellas Artes. And what he's going to do is he's going to create a Tiffany, he's going to create a stained glass screen that will then literally change coloring and basically take you from dawn to dusk. So this movement of time will happen if you ever go to the Palacio de Bellas Artes. before any performance, you will end up having the Tiffany glass literally just come before you and start to shift, and you actually feel as if you are in the presence of volcanoes and presence of one of his works of art. So he inserts this in a very profound way. Here in the Valley of Mexico, much like what we were seeing with the work of Velasco, he will incorporate the nopal, so very much tied to some of the traditions of using the landscape and Mexico as its identifier, that's manifested also and incorporated into its flag and its currency. Here is one on a starry night, again, very prolific, and this is really all he does. So what we have here is the eruption against a night sky, and references here to the embers that are literally part of the lava flow. Another one as well, very powerful. You have a sense of that energy that's coming forward. A self-portrait, so here he places himself as an aged man, engaging with us, just like what we saw 3/4 turn with the portrait that Jose Maria Velasco did for himself as well. What I wanted to say to end our issue, it was not only his identity with the landscape that's important, that makes him a precursor to Mexican modernism, but he does something important in 1906. And what he does is he creates a manifesto calling for the development of a monumental public art movement. Now, he does this in 1906, and we're going to see this, why this is so important. That public art movement doesn't come into play until the 1920s. And this is where we see all of that with the works of Diego Rivera and the three great Mexican muralists. So he's calling it very early on. He's connected to this. It will be an idea that will then be cultivated with the Secretary of Education, Jose Vasconcelos. We'll look at him next week. But it's a manifesto that underscores the importance now with wanting to communicate with the masses, with the people, and to share this identity, to be able to move in the direction of having a much more, move away from this academic painting that placed them as outsiders and incorporate them into the works themselves.